right, welcome everybody to this episode of O365A. On today's episode, we're going to continue our series about extending Microsoft Copilot for Microsoft 365. And today we're joined by Waldek Mastikash. And Waldek is a principal cloud developer advocate at Microsoft. And he's going to talk today specifically about extending Copilot using Microsoft Graph connectors, both to extend Copilot to access line of business data or data that is outside of the regular ecosystem of Microsoft 365 and available to Graph. So welcome, Waldek, and I'll just turn it over to you to do a quick intro and introduce Graph connectors.
Absolutely. Excited to be here. So as you said, I am a developer advocate for M365 and Microsoft, where we showed devs what can they do with our exciting stuff, right? So we release different things that allow you to extend Teams, SharePoint, and now also Copilot for Microsoft 365. And with that, we want to tell everybody what actions or what abilities we introduce and how to best put them to use. So with that, as you said, let's talk about the connectors. So let me share my screen and give you a little bit of intro, not too much, but just a little bit so that you have a better idea of what connectors are and how you can best put them to use. Then we will see a little demo, and then we'll dive into the code for those of us who love code. All right, sharing my screen. Please let me know when it's through. It's on. Excellent. All right. So connectors, right? Connectors are kind of like, in a high-level overview, one of the two ways in which you can extend Copilot from Microsoft 365, right? So one way are the connectors, would allow you to ingest external content that isn't a part of Microsoft 365 to Microsoft 365. And that is cool because through that, Microsoft 365 is now aware of something that is stored externally to it. And that's cool because that content is visible in search. You can share it with others. And also, you can track activity. You can track events around it recorded by yourself. And that also drives the relevance of it. So in other words, you can not only search for it, but you can also find new content that you weren't aware of because a colleague of yours edited it or shared it with somebody else, right? So all of that assumes that you've got access to it. And then you kind of have this cool ability that you can find the content, discover it, and now also be able to give the LLM, Copilot for Microsoft 365, access to it so that it can give you, more relevant answers to the prompts you might have, right? So that is like one of the two ways in which you can extend Copilot for Microsoft 365 with access to the data that isn't stored on Microsoft 365 itself. And then the other one are plugins, which allow you to have real-time access to external API, right? So we will not talk about that. We'll talk about the connectors. So far, so good?
No, makes sense.
I see a nod. I see a thumbs up. Let's go on. Perfect. So what is a connector? A connector, put it really simple, is a piece of code that you can run anywhere you want, and that does three things. It creates a connection. So in M365, it creates a connection. And think of it as a container to which you upload external data that you ingest to Microsoft 365, right? So one, it creates the connection. Two, it defines schema for the content you want to ingest. So if you ever done anything, let's say around search, whether that was Azure AI search or some other search, there's always this part where you define schema for the content you ingest. So in other words, you define which properties you want to track for the content you are ingesting. It can be title, author, modified date, tags, but also the body, the blob that you actually want to upload that you want to make available to search. So that is kind of like exactly that, right? So you define the shape of the content you are ingesting. And if you have two connectors or three, each of them can have a schema of its own, right? Because if you, let's say, ingest a knowledge article, that will have different shape than let's say a contract, right? So you define that shape for every connection you create. And basically, based on that, you can also show the data that you ingest in the results whenever you search for things that match the connect or the content that you've ingested, right? So we have a connection and schema. And the third part is actually it's the engine that gets the content from its original source, whether that's directly a database, file storage, API, and ingests that to Microsoft 365. And when it does, it includes at minimum three things. It may include four. So one is the content itself, like the body, the blob, actually the content that you actually want to ingest. So one, two, the data about the content itself. So it can be again the title, the author, modified date, and so forth and so on. Then the ACLs. That is a really key part. Because what you want to do is you want to ensure that only people who actually have the access to the content that you are ingesting can see it in Microsoft 365 too, right? So if you build a connector, you need to ensure that the permissions from the original source are exactly the same in Microsoft 365 when you ingest the content. So you need to keep them in sync. And the final parts are activities. And activities, as I said, allow you to boost the relevance of the content when either you search for it or also give you the ability to find out about the content for which you don't search but might be relevant because somebody around you, somebody with whom you work, did some activity on it. And again, all given the fact that you have the access to it. So in other words, if I view something but you don't have the access to it, you will die like that activity will not be relevant to you, right? Like you will not be able to see it anyway because you don't have the access to that through ACLs. Does that make sense? So far, so good. That's a nod. That's a four nods. I am doing well. Thank you. Cool. So thinking of that, right? Like what is the simplest connector that you could ever build? It's exactly what you see on a screen. Like first of all, like you have data source that you are ingesting. It can be file share, it can be blob, it can be API, whatever you want it to be. Then you have the connector code. It can be as simple as PowerShell script. It can be Azure function. It can be a fully, cloud native app on Kubernetes, whatever you want it to be. It's basically a code that you wrote that runs somewhere. That code is going to use the Microsoft Graph in order for it to be able to authenticate, because Graph isn't an anonymous API. You need to authenticate in order to be able to use it. You need an Entra AppReg, right? And that AppReg determines which permissions your app has on Microsoft Cloud. In this case, you will need access to create a connection and upload the items to it. So you will need at minimum two scopes. You can have more if you want to enrich the data with additional info that's already stored on Microsoft 365. But at minimum, you will have these two scopes, again, to create the connection and ingest the content to it. And then the final part is calls to Microsoft Graph. Again, you will have three calls. You will have the call to create a connection. You will have the call to create schema. And then three, for each item, you will call the Microsoft Graph to ingest the item to Microsoft 365. So a connector, in other words, can be as simple as a script that you run one-off. If you have, let's say, content like HR policies that don't change at all, or maybe change once a year, it might be just a script that you run on your box and it's done. It can also be something that runs all the time in a cloud, responds to events in the source system. The moment something will change there is going to reflect immediately in that sync, right? So it depends on your need how elaborate the connector that you create is going to be. The easiest one is this. It can be as complex as that, where it can work with, ingestion queues, handling events, keeping track of what's ingested, syncing ACLs. It can get really elaborate. It can be simple, it can be elaborate, and everything in between. So far, so good. I bet you have at least a question or two. Not everybody.
No, it all makes sense, Valdek. I'm interested, and maybe this is a good segue into what you're going to show. But when we talk about custom data sets, obviously that schema part is really important. Trying to map the schema to the connector so that the queries make sense. Can you just give us a high-level description on how that is accomplished?
Yeah, so I think we will have a look at that in a code, right? Where we'll be able to go through the properties that you said, what different types there are, what are the different things you need to keep track of. So I say let's keep that in mind because we will see that in a minute in action, in example, and I think that that will give us a better idea, like how does that exactly work? Okay.
Perfect.
Cool.
Question.
Anything else at this stage? Yep.
Yeah. On the Copilot side, can it map corresponding or join data from multiple connectors? So if there was one source that was giving you, I don't know, maybe customer IDs, and then another source was file repository that had the customer IDs, could Copilot kind of link across different connectors, or?
In theory, right? So if you would deploy multiple connectors, have the connections content ingested, described in a way that LLM can understand that, in theory, it could. How would that work in practice? I think that that depends very much on the, the prompt that you would issue and how clear it is. What is it that you're after, right? And to what extent it knows how to understand the properties from one source with properties from another and how to cross-link the items. So in theory, yes. In practice, we will need to test and verify.
Yeah. In the definition of what the data is that just the schema architecture, or is there like prompting that you also provide to Graph of explaining the data and the details of the data?
No, so as part of a connector, you only have schema, right? Okay. And there will be eventually down the road some other abilities to tell more about data. But as for now, schema is how you explain the content shape to Microsoft 365 all up, whether that's Copilot or Search. Okay. Perfect. So I guess with that, how about we see it in action? You ready? All right, cool. So what I've done so far, what I've got here, I've got a tenant, and I've already ran the connector so that we can see it in action. Otherwise, it will be as exciting, as to watch paint dry. So I thought, like, let me do that work ahead of time so that we can talk about the cool things. What I've got here, right? So I am now on the office.com or the Microsoft 365.com side on the enterprise search. And I created a connector that ingests some of the docs that we have on Learn on Microsoft Graph. So I copied like 10 articles from our docs, ingested them to Microsoft 365 with a connector that I built. And you can see the results here, which are depicted by this icon, right? That stands for graph. So what I've done here, I search for terms. This is just plain search, right? So there's no AI here, it's just search, right? And the lexical search that we have already on Microsoft 365. I search for some terms that match these articles. And what's really cool to see is that articles that I've ingested are coming back in results. Right? And these are all adaptive cards, so you can set it up how it's going to look. Like you can choose whether you want to show the title, URL, the short blurb, or you can even choose to show additional info here. And that is really cool because the properties that you have ingested in your schema, you can reuse all of them here, right? So basically the results that you show in search for everybody, you control how it's shown. And that's really cool because if you have ability to access some additional things like maybe a customer name or some labels on or tags, product numbers, or anything you would want to show, you have full ability to customize how you show that in search. So it's really, really cool because, again, the cool thing is that this is search on Microsoft 365. The users in your org, the employees, right? They no longer need to know where the content that they see here is originally stored. It can be stored anywhere, right? It can be stored in any LOB app that you use in your org. They will be able to find it from a central place. And what's cool is that all of these links point to the original source. So from here, they can look for things from a single place, but then go to the actual source where the content actually is, right? So that can be a deep link to your LOB app. So in other words, they don't need to go across 3 or 4 apps to find things. They can find it from here and then eventually end up in the exact app that they need. So that is really cool, and that is search, right? So that has been uh, available already for a while now. Like in theory, no, nothing new, but I think like this is one of the abilities that I think many folks aren't aware of, and which is really cool, especially if you have many apps in your org. One of the ideas you struggle with is the ability to find things. So I think this is a great thing for you to keep in mind, that you can offer this ability in your org to easily find things no matter where they are stored. So one. But now let's go to Copilot for Microsoft 365. So here on the screen, you see a chat that I had earlier this day with my AI assistant, and I'm a dev, right? So I asked it how to create a graph client. And here you can see like LLM Word, the answer of you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to like, and it will even give me some examples in C#, in JavaScript. But what's really cool here is if we scroll down, that it cites the sources. And these, if you look at the links, are again coming from Learn. Not because Copilot for M365 already knew about it, but these are the items that I ingested. So it can pick it up because I enabled it as its source, and now it knows of it and can use it with whenever I prompt anything about graph, like how do I get a client, how do I get a token, anything that I've ingested to it, I can ask it about that, and I will get the answers. And what's really cool is that I will get also the link to the source, so I can verify that it's true. I can get some additional info that I didn't get here, or I can just stay in this interface and then chat with it some more, asking it for more elaborate examples, maybe examples that are tied to my needs, and basically that way find relevant info and get the answers to the things that I need. So this is how it works in action. So far, so good. And what questions do you have? Shoot away.
I have a quick question. So
Yeah.
when Copilot is dealing with the data in Microsoft 365, it's easy to put, your kind of access boundaries around that data, who has access to what. You can only query the things that you have access to. When you start going into other systems, like maybe ticketing systems or customer data, how do you control who can see what when it's kind of a layer removed from the kind of the Microsoft boundaries?
So that is a great thing and a key thing when you work with connectors and you ingest the content from some other source to Microsoft 365. A part of that ingestions are ACLs, right? So basically the access control list that decides who can see particular item, right? And for each item you ingest, you need to pass an ACL. An ACL can be of two types. You either allow somebody access or disallow somebody access. And then you have a choice whether you allow access to a person, a group, or some external group that you might have, right? So you have the ability to create external group that you say, okay, in my LOB app, we have this group, and then these users from M365 or from Entra ID are the members of this group. And then you give access to that group, but then you map it to users that you've got in Entra. So at some point, you will need to make the mapping between the users you've got in Entra versus the account. Like if the external app does not use SSO and you have another account there, you will need to make the mapping when you ingest the items. If you have SSO, well, that is easier because the only thing you need to do is to get the info about the access from your LOB app and then replicate that when you ingest items. We can see that in practice. So let me show you the code of a connector, and then we will see this exact example, right? So again, if we think back about a connector, like we've got a few things. Like first, we've got the connection, right? So this is a C# code of how you would build a connector, and this is Easy App, right? So it's on purpose easy so that you can see the connector parts, but it's probably not something you would run in production, right? It wouldn't probably deal with scale, and all of that. So this is a great example, and we can share the link to this because we have it available in GitHub. But this is a great example to learn kind of the mechanics of a connector, right? So first, again, we have the connection. The connection has an ID. That ID is a unique identifier of a connection in a tenant. So this is a key part. Then we have the name. So this is basically a display name that admin will see when they look at the connectors or the connections that are available in their tenant. And then we have a description that explains a little bit more about what a connection is for. Curtis, I see you have a question about something. Maybe before. Well, all of you have questions. Okay, not everybody at once. Curtis first.
Yeah, I'll try to keep this quick. So permissions aside, one of the biggest concerns with all this technology, including Copilot, large language models, is that it learns something from using a data source that another user, through certain prompting techniques, could get answers to or get at, even though they don't have permissions to the data. Maybe you could just talk to that concern in this model, whereby even though I don't have direct permissions to the underlying source, hopefully I won't be able to, through prompt injection or prompting techniques, get at that data.
No, you will not. That will be physically impossible, right? Because what's really cool about this is that the data you ingest, they are not becoming a part of the model itself, right? So if you know about how LLM work, there is the thing called RAG, which means basically enrichment after the fact. So you have the model that is trained on a data set, but then additionally, you add data from an external source to it, and that basically use that to craft an answer to user, right? So RAG and model are two different things, right? So the model is basically what the data was, or what AI was trained on, the data set, and then you have external sources, right? So this is part of that RAG pattern, right? So there is no way, if ACLs are set correctly, there's physically no way for you to get access to something you are not allowed to view.
All right.
Period.
Yeah, good.
That was easy.
Thanks for clarifying that, because I know a lot of people have those concerns. Yeah.
Absolutely. Habib.
Yeah. So last podcast we had Vincent on with us, and he talked about the plugin capabilities. Is there any type of potential collision between like the connectors, getting the data, and or the plugins getting the data if you have them enabled, or is it more like a complement to one another when stuff is being returned?
In theory, you could expose the data set via two ways, right? Like the benefit that you get from the connectors is kind of the semantic search around it, right? Because otherwise, if you would do it through an API, then you will get at the API, you will get either the keywords or a prompt, and then you need to match it to the data that you've got stored. So in other words, you need to implement your own search. Whereas if you use the connectors path to get the data in, then you benefit kind of from the enterprise search that we've got available on Microsoft 365. Then for the API part, I think that is really like the combining the two really shines when you use the connectors for getting the data through things like search, and then use a plugin to update data. So imagine that you've got maybe you've got IT policy and you have a ticket, right? So imagine that I want to buy a laptop, right, for work. Like first, I might want to know the policies around, like what devices am I allowed to buy? So that is like typical search, like what is the policy on X? Once I know that, I create a ticket. So creating a ticket, I would do via a plugin because a connector can only read, right? So it only gets the data to Microsoft 365, but it cannot write, it cannot change anything in the source. But I can do that via a plugin because that offers me not only get abilities, but also write abilities. Right, so combining the two makes definitely sense in many of the cases for which you would really want to apply LLM in real world scenario.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, I was just curious whether or not there would be any issues. But it kind of feels like it's more of a complement, depending on sort of what your scenario is, which is cool.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dino.
Yeah, I was going to just play off Habib's question and ask about what are the where would you take the decision, or how would you look at deciding between a connector and a plugin? Just maybe the top reasons to go down that path.
Yeah.
Just for the listeners that have never, experienced either of these, what are the starting points?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the first thing I'd look at is what is it that I want to achieve, right? And what is the data shape that I want to give LLM access to? So if that would be unstructured blob, think knowledge base article, policy, contract, manuals, my first bet would go to use a connector, because again, I get to benefit from semantic search. I don't need to build VectorDB. I don't need to build my own search and expose it behind an API. I get all of that because all of that is already available to me through a connector and the features that we've got in Microsoft 365. So 1. 2, if I need to change anything in an external app, if I need to create a ticket, update a ticket, update customer data, create order, I cannot do that with a connector. So there will be obviously a pure play for a plugin. So I think like these are the two easiest ways to look at it, right? When you get the data and the data is a blob and you don't have a search ability available on it already, then that would be a candidate for a connector, because again, building search isn't trivial, right? So if you can reuse the one that is available on M365, that is a great ability, not to mention that the content you ingest will be available in Copilot, Search, and also in Outlook, and you'll be able to share it with other folks too, right? So like that would be, let's say, high level rule of thumb, how you can think about building a connector versus doing a plugin.
Sure, thanks.
All right, so with that, get back to our code. We had a quick look at the connection. Let's have a look at another part, which is the schema. So I think you asked about that. What are the different things that you need to include in a schema, right? So schema basically is set of properties about the content, basically the data that you want to store about the content that you are ingesting. Each one has a name and type. It can be a string, it can be decimal, it can be a date, a number, a collection of strings like tags. So you need to set that. Then you have a series of options that are more geared towards the experience that you've got in search. So is queryable mean like, can you use that in query? Can you search specifically for that? In other words, look for policies that contain in a title word X. So these are, again, things that you might want to do in search, but you wouldn't do in an LLM, because LLM doesn't give you this ability to build, elaborate search queries. Another one is searchable. So in other words, when you do a full text search, will that property, the content of it, be included in that or not? Another one is, can you show that thing back in results in search? So as we've seen first, I had the results in search, and in there I showed the title, URL, and a little blurb. I can choose to show any property in there that I want that I ingest, but it needs to be marked as retrievable, right? Because like otherwise, I will not be able to show that in the results. And then the final things are the labels. So the labels allow me to give semantic meaning to properties that I create in schema. In other words, I could call this thing foo, but I can tell search that this is actually a title that represents title of my item. And that is important because Copilot for M365 requires that each external item or each item you ingest to Microsoft 365 has three properties, right? It needs to have the title, URL, and I lost the third one. I think that might be, I don't know. I'll get back to you. There are three, but basically, like here, you have the whole list of properties that you can set on the content, and the key part is that again drives the relevance because internally our search has a model where it, for example, ranks. If you search for something and that word comes back in a title, that is worth more than if it a single word in a big blob in body, right? So in other words, we rank the different terms, and this way we can tell that this property that we are ingesting corresponds to a title, description, author, URL, and so forth and so on, right? So that's exactly why it's always good practice to include them, right? They aren't required for search, but they are 3 required if you want to use connector with Copilot from Microsoft 365. Right? So that covers schema part. Any questions about that?
I think we're good there.
Okay, cool. So once we have that, we get to our code. And the code does 3 parts. We start with 2. We create the connection, and in the connection, we create schema. In other words, we define the shape of the content that we are ingesting. Like I said, these are 2 calls to Microsoft Graph. We create a connection, which is a post, and we upload schema. So basically the shape that you have just seen, that matches 1-to-1 the shape that Microsoft Graph expects from us to create schema within a connection. It's really as simple as that. Once you do that, you wait a minute or 2 for it to become available. And basically from that point on, the only thing you need to do is part 3, which means ingesting the content from your original source to Microsoft 365. So, and that the way that works is, I don't know if you folks know about ETL. So extract, transform, load. That is very, like data science, data management term, which basically says you extract the data from a source, you change its shape, transform its shape, and then you load it into another place, ETL. Graph connector is exactly that. It implements ETL because I'm getting the data from a source. I am doing an extract. I change its shape to match the external item type that I need for the Microsoft Graph, and then I do load. I upload the external items to Microsoft Graph and Microsoft 365. Right. So in this example, as I said, I've got a couple articles from our docs, right? So these are basically the markdown files that we have in our docs. So I use that as my source. So as part of my extraction, I load them from the disk, parse the markdown, because in a connector, you can upload the blob, the content part, either as plain text or HTML. So if you have a PDF, binary, CAD drawing, you need to change that because otherwise, like, search will not know how to handle that. So the body, the blob, which you need to upload, must be either plain text or HTML, right? So this is everything that I do here in extraction. I read the content from the source. Then 2, I change its shape because the Microsoft Graph expects me to upload external item. So that is kind of the entity name, entity type on Microsoft Graph that corresponds to all the items that I want to ingest from original source, right? So I need to change the shape of the articles that I read from disk into external item. And in here, I map the data that I have in Markdown. So in here, I've got title, description, author, some other things, and I map that to the properties that I've got in schema, right? So here you see title, description, URL, and these match one-on-one properties that we have here, right? So here we've got title, description, URL. So these are exactly the same. So whatever you've got in schema, you will map that here when you change the shape from the original shape to an external item that you upload to Microsoft Graph. Then we set the content, and here is the echo part. Here is where you set who will have the access to it. This is fundamental part to get right. Like you aren't allowed to get this wrong, because otherwise you will allow people who aren't allowed to access it to view the item, right? So in this case, what you see on the screen, we say that we grant access to everyone in our org on this item. So everybody in our org will be able to see the docs that we have on Microsoft Graph simply because like they are public docs anyway, right? So in this case, it's perfectly fine to expose them to everyone. But again, you can choose that to be a person, a group, or whatever you need to basically ensure that only that specific group of folks will have access to it. Michael.
Two questions. So the value, if it's group or user, does it have to be object ID or could it be UPN?
Good question. I don't know off the top of my mind.
Okay.
I would need to check whether you need to resolve the UPNs to IDs, or would it be fine to use the UPN too? I don't know.
And then another question that's maybe a little bit further to the user experience. When Copilot's exposed in the Office apps, say Word, you have the ability to say like, create me a scope of work based on this other file, and you can reference a file with like the / command. Is there a way to reference a connector so that you're really pulling in a specific part of the source for whatever you request? So like, create me a statement of work for customer XYZ based on the Graph connector, so that it's pulling the data from that versus a file?
I don't think you can do that just yet. I wouldn't be surprised if we offer that at some point because it makes perfect sense. Yeah. Anything else about it so far? Anything else about ACLs, about schemas? Yes.
Yeah, so let's say you're pointing this connector to a SharePoint site that is already ACLed. Like only specific users should be seeing some of like the data in that SharePoint site, like documents are secure, there may be sensitivity labels. But then you build this connector and you say everyone.
Yep.
Does that mean that anybody that has access to this connector can see all that data?
Yes. Because basically you ingest the content, so you create a copy of the content that you have stored elsewhere. And when you ingest it here as a body, then everybody will be able to see whatever you upload in here.
So I guess you got to be super, super careful what you point the connector at.
And the ACLs, yeah.
And the ACLs, absolutely. Like that is like, this is a typical example of, measure twice or thrice at once.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good point.
Anything else? No questions. Oh my God, I answered all your questions. It never happens. So I guess I hope that gives you a little bit of overview of what a connector is, what it empowers you to do, and kind of the benefits you get across Search, Copilot, and other apps in Microsoft 365. Again, the benefits being you being able to find the content from a single place, no matter where it's stored, right? So that is really the key part. One thing that I would like you all to do, and you gentlemen and everybody who listens, to basically check out the samples that we've got for it and the modules that we've got, because then you will be able to see all of that in practice and try it on your own. Like, get samples, press F5, see it running, because that will give you a great experience with how it works. What is it, that you can achieve with that? Experiment with your own apps, data you've got, and see it in action. Because I bet that once you see that, you will get immediately tons of new ideas how you can help everybody in your org to more easily find the data that you've got available across different apps that you use in your work.
So you just asked one of the last questions, or answered one of the last questions I had, was, in my experience getting started with this stuff, it's best to just dive in and use some pre-made samples. So there you go. There's a URL for it.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. And I'll just add, I think the big benefit here is not only exposing it through search, but through the LLM interface, right? So people can ask natural language questions and get answers on that data set.
Absolutely, right? Because sometimes you don't know, you might not exactly know the right term to find it through a keyword search, but that is really the power that we've got in LLM, right? The ability to express the things in a way that we think about them and having LLM, apply its intelligence and experience with language to find the things as no matter how they are exactly phrased. So that is definitely a benefit. And also it simplifies, the user experience a lot too, because it makes it so much easier to get answers to the things that we need to do.
I have one more question.
Of course.
How flexible is the controlling of the adaptive card for the results? Like, can you embed video? Say we were to put this against like all our videos for the podcast. Could we put the transcription as well as the video and have that surface in the adaptive card in search, or put button controls or anything like that?
I don't think that you would be able to play the video in place, but you could definitely include image like thumbnail with a link to play it, whether it's stored on Stream, YouTube, or some other place you might have them, right? So I think that would be an option, like playing the video in place. I don't think that you would be able to do that. Like that is just tad too far.
But those adaptive cards are really powerful. A great way to interact and use the search results. So,
absolutely.
Good stuff. All right. Well, we'll cap it at that. Thank you very much, Waldek. That was fantastic. I'm looking forward to diving in and trying some samples out myself. And yeah, as bullet point number 3 there suggests, reach out if you have any questions and get stuck. I guess, Waldek, you're available on LinkedIn, Twitter, all that good stuff.
On X, definitely. Like you will find me no matter, and if not, like reach out to you, host, and you will find me because you have my email.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you, Waldek, for the time. Really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you later.
See ya, folks. Thank you.
Thanks.